Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to GeekWatch, a subsidiary of the monastery, the open bar of the internet. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me, as always, I have 1, 2, 3 good brothers. Ha 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 ha. We have making his GeekWatch debut, the man talking about all of your games, good brother Abraham.
It's so nice to be here among all of you fine individuals.
Good call, not saying gentlemen. We have the we have coming to us from Distorted Illuminations, good brother Monarch.
I deny the label of being a fine person. Horrible person.
And the man of 1,000 runes, the CEO of Zadari Enterprises, and the bane of my fucking existence, good brother Xanatrix.
Zadari Enterprises has a new announcement today. We did our final verification run, and we still saw that about 87% of you don't have dragon transformations in your mecha. That's okay. We went and did it for you. You're our subsidiaries now. We own you.
We've developed a bit of a reputation in the temple for taking a massive shit on certain traditions or certain assumptions when it comes to game design, when it comes to fiction writing, when it comes to the assessment of certain genres. And I think today we'll be adding to that particular legacy. And if it means that I end up having the reputation of being an asshole who keeps calling out certain narratives, well, I think I'll take that. But this time around, we venture a bit into fantasy and probably get some of the grogs annoyed. But as I've said many times, fuck the grogs.
Mm-hmm.
With one simple 3-word question: why not gunpowder? As you can see in the title. Now, this was something that I wanted to explore because it's been something of a pet peeve, I guess, for the longest of time. Especially in regards to what people consider high fantasy or medieval fantasy or that sort of kitchen sink approach. There seems to be an aversion to just using gunpowder in general and firearms in particular. And the reasons that have been given I've found questionable. And that's the kind of thing I'd like to explore here. Because we've talked quite a bit about design by gospel. You know, this idea of what you're supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to ranged combat, in a lot of what is considered generic fantasy or just fantasy in general, it always takes one of two forms: bows and crossbows. Maybe you get some thrown weapons here and there, but that's generally where the direction goes. And the first reason that's often given for no gunpowder is that it is based on medieval Europe. That a given setting is based on medieval Europe in some form. This is questionable, and correct me if I'm wrong, Zan, but I'm pretty sure that cannons were starting to become a thing even in that time period, as nebulous as it is described.
So, canon in Western Europe were a part of Siege War, at least I would say, in the late 1200s and almost all of the 1300s.
which would put it right in this particular time period.
Yeah. In fact, checking closely, the earliest known European depiction of a cannon appears in a manuscript by Walter de Millemete, and that manuscript is dated in 1326. I mean, there was even technically a hand cannon in 1380, and there are Tannenberg cannons found in the late 1300s, such as even 1399. So yeah, cannons were around during the Middle Ages for sure.
And as far and even though that's hand cannons and the whole unreliable, that kind of thing goes out the window when you're dealing with a non-Earth setting. As much as people say, "Oh, we're basing this on medieval Europe," yeah, but you're not playing in medieval Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Is something that I often bring up, and the Ottomans had the arquebus in the 15th century, which was one of the earliest forms of rifle.
Mm-hmm.
And hang on a sec. Let me adjust the volume thing. I'm gonna put you at 73%. So hopefully the loudness thing doesn't end up happening. It might be a sound issue, because sound engineering is a tricky matter.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the first thing to address when it comes to this whole we're basing it on medieval fantasy is how broad and how unspecific that ends up being. This is as good a time as any to go into what is meant by the Tolkien melting pot, as we call it. And Zan, I've covered that quite a bit, so I'll let you take that.
All right. So the Tolkien melting pot is this idea of generic Western fantasy pastiche worlds, where you take the common elements of high fantasy seen in a lot of Western fictional works, the architecture, the people, the demographics, the weaponry, all of it. It tends to centralize around what people imagined fantastical versions of the Middle Ages of Western Europe tended to be. I mean, a perfect example of something that falls into the Western fantasy pastiche is Tolkien's works. That's why we call it the Tolkien melting pot, because Tolkien's works are very close to that. They worked for his works very well. There's nothing wrong with that pastiche existing. What we have an issue with is when people assume the pastiche is all there is. When people hear the word fantasy, if they immediately think only of the Western fantasy pastiche, that's the issue we have.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to make clear there's nothing inherently wrong with having that pastiche. The problem develops when there's this idea of that's what you're supposed to do with fantasy. That's always been our big criticism of it.
Another example of design by gospel.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to firearms, I know there's plenty of examples of firearms in fantasy settings. There's several shown on screen, but those are often seen as some sort of anachronism, when in reality it shouldn't be. or the mere presence of it is enough to say, well, this is more of a steampunk setting. But is it?
Once again, while canon were not exactly around for the first half of the Middle Ages, because gunpowder hadn't been discovered by Marco Polo going to China yet, the canon still exists in the latter half of the Middle Ages, which is where it really counts.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes, there's also there. I look at it as a case of approaching fantasy in a way where people have accepted certain traditions and then just never questioned it. And this idea that if you do question it, that makes you some kind of maverick or something outside of the bubble. Another aspect of design by gospel I've talked about on occasion is a culture of conformity. Of course, where this really gets funny is the college know-it-all historians in certain parts of the OSR really end up conveniently ignoring this factor, or try and push it off to the side, or have it as something you're just not supposed to think about.
Mm-hmm.
And I know some people might say, but you have dwarves with cannons in World of Warcraft. Yes, you do. There's also a small part of me that wonders if dwarves with cannons would still be a thing if it weren't for what Warcraft was very much drawing upon, to the point where a lawsuit almost happened.
Well, I mean, a lawsuit almost happened until, Blizzard's Warhammer Fantasy with the serial numbers filed off was too distinct on its own.
Mm-hmm.
I think everyone forgets that Warcraft was originally going to be a Warhammer game until, Games Workshop and Blizzard had a big-ass disagreement.
Pretty much. And even with that, the question that I've often asked is why it has to be so heretical. And if I had to guess, I think it's two things. One, that's the way that a lot of people are used to it being presented, and two, as Abraham had hinted at earlier, ego.
And what is most puzzling is that when it comes to the origins of, for example, Dungeons and Dragons, they had a lot of inspirational material to apply those firearm rules and gunpowder to the setting. Dave Arneson used to play Strategos, the series of war games from 1880.
Mm-hmm.
And you had all of the rules for firearms there, but he never implemented that into Blackmoor. And Blackmoor is actually, some people don't know it, but it's actually a science fantasy setting. There is high technology, there are alien species, there are artifacts that could be considered way more advanced than simply gunpowder, and yet he never applied that to his campaign. Well, at least not as popular as you would expect it in other settings.
There's one other thing to bring up if you're going to bring up Blackmoor. There was the fact that a lot of the people involved in that Blackmoor campaign had previously done the Napoleon campaign with that same group, and of course, with Napoleonic warfare, you've got pike and shot.
Mm-hmm.
And I know some might say that that's the pike and shot era, not the medieval era. When designing a setting, putting aside the fact that everything in in a lot of those early settings was just them throwing a bunch of shit at the wall and seeing what stuck. Uh, there's no reason to, if you're doing a world that is not meant to replicate Earth, and you already aren't replicating Earth when you're introducing magic into the mix. Why should it follow that? Is a question I've often asked, and I've never gotten a straight answer from a lot of that crowd.
I think they also could have considered it a bit troublesome that they couldn't implement the lethality of firearms properly. Perhaps that's another reason why they kind of pushed it to the side for the most part.
And yet they're perfectly fine with the lethality of the mages
Fireballs.
getting all the damn spells, or
Magic missile.
Or
Yeah.
even if you're just looking at Dungeons and Dragons, all the shit that's in that game, it's obviously not from medieval Europe and inspired by other things. Even things they try to apply firearms don't belong to because of medieval Europe don't even stem from that.
that's one of the common arguments that gets made. Another argument I've seen is game balance, which I'm not as willing to go with, because when you look at bows and firearms in a lot of war games, since I brought up Warhammer earlier, I'll use that again here. The individual stats may be different, but it's not like having, like, there's a significant advantage to the dwarves having having whole firearm teams when it comes to the shooting phase. I'm not saying that they're underpowered, but it's just a part of the shooting phase, just one form of it, no different than any other ranged weapon. So the plus as hinted at before, can you really make the game balance argument when you already have your spellcasters breaking the damn game?
They'll make that argument regardless of whether they acknowledge that spellcasters are breaking the game or not.
It's a case of don't throw stones in the glass house.
Yep.
But even now I know we focused on tabletop quite a lot, but this is something that transcends just TTRPGs. It's just a lot of these traditions stem from more litigious games, and shit rolls downhill from there, so that's going to get a good amount of focus. But and I've seen the argument of, well, if firearms are a thing, then it pretty much makes melee weapons obsolete.
I mean, if we're using firearms from the same alleged medieval Western time period, not really. They take a long time to load, and they aren't very accurate, which is why accuracy by volume was always a thing.
And I do remember a throwaway line really early on in Star Wars: The Old Republic that ends up answering this particular question, because you can get shields as part of your equipment, personal shields. The catch is, though, those shields don't do all that well against melee weapons, which is why you're going to have people with vibro blades all over the place in that game.
Yep.
And if I have to go even further back, I'll bring up the whole thing with Dune.
The slow blade pierces, monk.
Mm-hmm. There's hell even I always remember the whole light shield thing with Outlaw Star, which can certainly work, but it has its limits. And yeah, those are leaning into science fiction or science fiction fantasy a little bit. But the point is that in a setting like that, you'd have even less reason to have melee weapons when guns are commonplace, and yet several of them do. And yeah, rule of cool is certainly a thing, but there's also the factor that in a lot of those cases you have an in-universe reason for why melee weapons are still used instead of just everybody using firearms. And hell, let's look at since since I've been laughing at the current issues that have been going on with its reboot. Let's look at Blade, the original Blade, not whatever shit they're trying to do with the MCU version of him. No, all the swords, the daggers, and firearms with him. Some of that is definitely the look cool factor, or LCF, but also when you're dealing with vampires, bullets sometimes aren't enough.
And even in conventional situations, it's not always the best choice. Just talk with any professional in military or any security force, and they're going to tell you that if there is a certain distance when you should not even think about drawing your firearm, it's a matter of a fraction of a second before the guy is on top of you. For example, there was this skilled swordsman, Donald McBain. Some call him the greatest swordsman, the greatest Scottish swordsman that you never heard about.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about that moment when he was being rushed by a Scottish warrior. It was a battle between Scots, in other words. And he took a shot at the guy, but you know that the Scottish warriors were famous because of their Highland charge sort of attack or offensive. And he went at him at Donald with his shield. There have been shields with bullets embedded into them, so it proves that the shields from that time, they actually stopped bullets. And Donald McBain had to use his firearm as a club because the guy was on top of him. Bullets would be useless. He wouldn't have time to recharge. And even though he managed to hit the guy in the head, he still kept going at him. That's one of the few times when Donald McBain actually had to run away because at that particular time, he was not as skilled when it comes to close quarters fighting.
Mm-hmm. And whenever it comes to the realism thing, I always have a bit of a laugh at that, because when a lot of people are using realism as part of their argument, the takeaway that I end up having is that it's used like a crutch. I mean, one of the phrases that I have in the temple is believability over realism. You know, the sense of I know it's unrealistic with what you're doing, but if you're presenting it in a way that's entertaining enough, I won't care.
Entertaining enough and consistent enough, because you don't want it pulling you out from the immersion either.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It matters more like it's an internal consistency to whatever world you've presented. If you can keep that, you can get away with all kinds of outrageous stuff. Just look at JoJo's.
Or just look at any sort of fiction that understands this principle.
I mean, I'm going to jump the shark here for a second and also bring up my favorite thing in the world. A lot of people dislike Gundam 00, especially with the 00 Riser and the 00 Quanta, but it still follows the internally consistent physics of that universe. Just because you don't like the fact that he can turn himself into quantum particles and temporarily go back in time a few seconds doesn't make it not cool as fuck. And anyone who believes otherwise can fucking fight me.
You know what's really funny? When somebody says that's ridiculous, but they're perfectly fine with new types.
I mean, to be fair, Monk.
To be fair,
To be fair, new types weren't exactly supposed to be people weapons. That's just what they became because, the Federation and Xeon were in the middle of a fucking war. Remember, people, if the new step in human evolution happens during a war, they will become warriors because, holy shit, how can we exploit them for war? Huh, who would have imagined?
And that's realistic. It's consistent.
Exactly. But firearms, you only see this scoffing at gunpowder weapons of any type, except for maybe, ye old Granaten, and I mean like the ones that are cartoonishly shaped like black sphere bombs. When it comes to the high fantasy that is, well, quote unquote medieval high fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
It really isn't a good argument for it as we've demonstrated thus far. It's really just people clinging to their idea of what high fantasy in that setting is, well, quote, supposed to be, end quote.
And the worst, most toxic thing you can do when it comes to a creative endeavor is try and establish these hard and fast laws of what you're supposed to do. Not that it's a good idea. The reason why we keep harping on designed by gospel is because it crosses over into do this because it's a good idea to do it because I said so.
Or worse, do it because this is how it's always been done, with no explanation of why it was done in the past. It's a shortcut for thinking. It's a dogma. It's one of those things that it happens because of the fact that people stop thinking, not because they're still creating.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the game balance argument, which is another one that I end up hearing. As I mentioned before, I find the way a lot of people use the game balance argument to be a security blanket at times. I've even seen people say that giving fighters a maneuver system is unbalancing it because it's giving them a magic system.
You mean something to do?
I mean,
Yeah.
we already had the great mage debate, Monk.
We already had the Great Mage debate, but I have to revisit it somewhat here because it's in that same ballpark.
Yes, absolutely.
And when it comes to game balance, I think a lot of people misunderstand what is meant by that. Because you notice that a lot of people, whenever they complain about something being unbalanced, it's because it's unbalanced again in a way that doesn't favor them.
It's unbalanced in a way that isn't immediately beneficial to them specifically. Yes, like when we talked again in the Great Mage debate, and how they said giving martial classes, as Monarch so bluntly put it, something to do. It was breaking game balance. It's like, no, you just don't get to centralize the game around yourself anymore. And considering that these are supposed to be group-played games, that's a good thing.
That's something that a lot of people end up forgetting. That it's and even when we're not dealing with games, a lot of fantasy stories are ensemble stories.
I mean, people be like, "What do you mean a lot of fantasy stories are ensemble stories?" I can point to the fact that even stories that look like it's a singular hero are still ensemble stories. It's just an ensemble supporting cast. Hello, any of Arnold's Conan movies.
Mhm.
Yes, Conan is the name, and we're following Arnold as Conan, but he has friends helping him every step of the way.
It's and you look at it. You look at any pulp character, and it's usually not just them. They usually have a rotating supporting cast that goes in and out.
Yep.
Even Sherlock Holmes had that. Like what is Sherlock if not for Watson?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, with as much as some people dislike Temple of Doom, what you with Indiana Jones, it's not just him. It's him bouncing off of a rotating support group. Of course,
Mostly short round though.
yeah,
Temple of Doom. Why do people hate Temple of Doom?
I don't fucking know.
I like it. I like
it.
I mean, in some ways it's really stupid, but
I mean,
that's what makes it fun.
I think part of it might be the fact that theocracy nerds didn't like the melding of Aztec and Hindi themes, because Kali is a Hindu goddess, I might add.
Fuck those people. I want to see a guy pull someone's heart out.
Like,
And then feed him into a volcano and somehow have the heart burn in his hand. Let's side note. Let's just address the fact that for most of the movie, no matter what Indiana Jones movie you look at, for most of the movie, it's fairly grounded. I mean, the adventures themselves are zany and wacky, but the things that happen in those adventures are fairly grounded. And then you get to the part where a guy pulls a heart out of another guy's body, dips him into a volcano, and the guy's heart burns in his hand. Or they find a golden ark and open it up, and the ghosts inside kill anybody who has their eyes open.
The wrath of God melts their face.
Just I really would just or no, the big one. You find a hidden temple in the Middle East that has an immortal Knight of the Round Table and the cup of the Son of God. And when you try to accidentally, or when someone doesn't try to accidentally remove it, you fall into a great crevasse forever. Oh, also you heal your dad with the cup and some water.
And if you drink from the wrong cup, your face, you shrivel, you become a corpse.
Exactly. Like, for most of those movies, he's fighting someone or something that's fairly mundane compared. And then you get the climax. The climax of every movie is supernatural in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get Crystal Skull, and that's where the pattern is broken, and I'm not going to go further anymore. Back to the rails. Sorry, everybody.
the one thing I will note with the one thing I will note with Crystal Skull, just to wrap that up. A lot of people got mad at about the whole nuke the fridge thing. I don't see that. I think that particular problem was overblown. And as far as going with aliens, what did people expect with something themed around the Crystal Skull?
I think the funnier thing is we got Crystal Skull vodka from Dan Aykroyd after that because he's batshit crazy. No, you.
Yes, I know. I've seen it.
Dan Aykroyd is batshit crazy because of the fact that apparently his entire family was supernatural hunters of some sort. It's the reason why the stuff that happened in the Ghostbusters movies was actually so detailed, because it came from like notes from his family or something.
Mm.
But again, Rails, be that as it may.
But now I do a lot of people when it comes to the balance thing. I think that the idea that you can't that if you have firearms in the same realm that you have bows and crossbows, one of them becomes obsolete. I don't think that is the case. In fact, I look at it as a opportunity from a game design perspective to have both of them have different play styles that they encourage.
And sometimes it works in both ways. I remember that someone asked the designer of Eberron, "Hey, why didn't you make firearms a common thing in Eberron?" And he said, "Well, you already have ones that shoot out magic missiles, so there's no need for firearms."
Pretty much. There's and of course with Eberron is a weird beast. With some of the aspects being more emphasized than others in terms of the weirdness. I think it's easy to see why that setting won that contest that Wizard of the Coast did back when Wizard of the Coast actually had a head on their shoulders. But but as somebody who's been a longtime fan of console style RPGs, you have fantasy settings in those that can happen to have firearms. What's the issue? Or let's look at Thief. Thief's setting, the city that it seems to have, is very much doing medieval fantasy, a little bit early Renaissance maybe, but it just happens to have electricity, and later robots.
Robots. We love robots. We stand robots.
See, the weird thing about this is I don't often hear this stuff like applied to video games. I'm not saying no one does, but just people seem to just accept whatever more often in relation to guns in games. Some extreme examples, maybe not, but
If I had to guess, it might be due to the fact that the culture of conformity doesn't manifest itself as easily.
or even if you look at like some of the earliest days of like RPGs, like just look at Final Fantasy. You had airships by the Super Nintendo. You had all the Magitech stuff, and somebody suplexing trains.
Why do you think I kept roasting people kept calling people out when they were saying that FF16 was returning to the series' medieval roots?
There's been no such thing. We've been through this.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to know the greatest example of gunpowder not replacing bows or crossbows?
Shoot.
Mm-hmm.
The greatest example? Real fucking life! There are still bows and crossbows used to this day by people. And I know some smartass in the fucking comments is going to go, yeah, but not to kill people. Bullshit. There are arrows and bolts designed for both that have broadheads laid laterally to go between the ribs of a bipedal animal. Those arrows are not for shooting quadrupeds whose ribs are vertical. There are arrows that have vertical broadheads just for that, but there are still arrows designed that have horizontal broadheads.
And there's that guy in Second World War. There was this guy, I forget his name, Mad something or something like that. He only used a bow. He didn't use firearms at all, and he survived the entire thing, and he was pretty good at it.
Yeah, the firearm may be the massive muscle that moves war in Common Era, but bows and crossbows both have the unique advantage of, well, no fucking sound.
Mhm.
And in other, especially with something like a repeater crossbow, which we can make modern versions of pretty easily, you even have a handheld, near silent, effective weapon with a magazine. Now, is it great for everything? No, but no weapon is. Every weapon has its role.
And there's also the availability and resources to consider, because depending on where you are and the materials available, it could be a lot cheaper to create bows, crossbows. In the case of a setting with magic, not everyone will be capable of manufacturing magical ones, but they could create firearms.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of a firearm powered by magic is something that I've always found interesting. Or just when you're introducing magic into the equation, there's potential for technological advancements that I think a lot of fiction writers and just fans of fantasy don't really consider. Like,
I created a when I was homebrewing for 3 and 3.5, I created a steam-powered blunderbuss that is entirely made through physical objects and magic, no gunpowder. And you had to train in it, otherwise you might blow up your blunderbuss in your hands, which caused you some damage.
so you treat it as an exotic weapon?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's low in it requires A, wizards to make, and B, is somewhat expensive to make sure it stays strong enough to contain a miniature steam explosion, Monk. And people ask me, well, what's the in-lore universe thing? I'm like, some random wizard accidentally created a steam explosion in a cave, and he realized that this could be used to propel stuff. So he theorized, I'm going to put a minimized fireball spell inside a magic crystal that also has water in the crystal. And then you have to use a special magical pick to rupture the crystal, causing the fireball to hit the water at the same time, and then propel your shot. So it requires coordination as well, because they hadn't yet created a system where pull trigger equal thingle boom. You have to pull trigger 1 to make hammer strike crystal, and then pull trigger 2 almost exactly at the same time. Not exactly at the same time, almost exactly at the same time, to open the shutter to allow the steam to force the shot out. The weapon was hella overpowered as well, because it was a 15-foot cone, and it did 3d4 piercing damage with the shot and 3d6 steam damage, because, well, that's super hot scalding steam.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the whole balance thing, like I said, a lot of people misinterpret, whether intentionally or otherwise, the nature of game balance. And Zan, you and I have had an ideal counter argument to the game balance question, in the form of Brawl Minus.
The borker, the better.
Which we ended up utilizing that mindset with FF Legend to an extent. But I think going into what Brawl Minus is and how we use it as our counter argument to game balance is applicable here.
Okay. I'll try to give the Cliff's Notes version.
Mm-hmm.
Super Smash Bros. Brawl had a very large roster that was very unbalanced, because it is a party fighter and not intended as a competitive fighter. There were 2 mods created. There was 1 mod created to try and balance this out for competitive purposes, called Brawl Plus, where they tried to make characters that were entirely unviable, at least somewhat viable, and characters that were entirely overpowering closer to the center. Essentially, they tried to squash the curve. Brawl Minus grew up out of this, thinking, well, why don't we just take everybody and make them as broken as possible? And in so doing, made a very, very fun party fighter, like more fun than the base party fighter, that was full of random, stupid bullshit that you'd normally go, that's unfair if you were playing a competitive game. But since you're playing this game that is clearly intended to be a party game, you are instead laughing your ass off the entire time.
Mhm.
And this is Brawl Minus. Brawl Minus is a love, a long love of mine, and I would not trade my time with Brawl Minus for any other time with Brawl in the world.
The key thing here is that instead of lowering everything to put it at a baseline, instead have everybody be some degree of borked.
They inversed the standard deviation. Let's put it that way. Everybody knows the standard deviation looks like a bell curve. Instead, this was just a spike, a very spiky spike, at the very end of the percentile lane.
Yeah. For us, I think where we draw the line when it comes to the right and wrong ways, when it comes to balance, it is when something has such an advantage that it ends up stepping on other people's toes.
When it centralizes the game.
Mm-hmm. This is why I had the rule that anyone who picks Odd Job gets punched in the nuts when it comes to GoldenEye.
Yeah. No, this is why so many people have a problem with high-level casting classes in the world's most litigious game. A high-level casting class can, in about one turn, not one round, one turn, make most combat encounters trivial. It allows no one else to play the game, and it centralizes the game around this one person, and then they have to take a long rest because they've blown all their spells.
Mm-hmm. And since I mentioned earlier that the idea of having firearms, more traditional missile weapons and melee weapons in the same game provides opportunities, I think this is as good a time to point out that the Artificer is the perfect counter argument to that line of thinking. That whole, oh, if we introduce firearms, it'll unbalance things or make certain things obsolete.
Yeah, but then you're going to hear the screeching in the comments of, the Artificer's technically a magic class.
Well, when it comes to the Artificer in Sword World. Then yes, in the most litigious role-playing game, the Artificer is just another form of caster that can't seem to do what it's supposed to, because it's been stuck in a no man's land since day one. The Sword World Artificer is a different matter. They're the only ones who get access to guns. The guns are primarily used for their Magitech effects, and a lot of them are about firing enchanted bullets.
I mean, the Artificer in Sword World is a caster class, but it's a caster class that, I cast gun.
There's also the fact that, as was very much established during the Sword World Study Hall stream, casting classes in Sword World are nothing like casting classes in the most litigious role-playing game.
Yo.
Because well, the closest thing to a cleric might be a conjurer, but the stuff that clerics do, conjurers aren't really doing that.
I would argue the closest thing that a cleric is a priest, monk.
Well, yeah, there is the priest, and even then, I believe there is some equivalent to turning effects, but it's but it's not universally turn undead, which I'm perfectly fine with because it never made sense. Because it never made sense that no matter your deity, you're always having turn undead.
Yep.
Like if you're a priest of Kord, why would Kord give a shit about the undead?
His turn would be turn weak. Turn the weak. Embrace only the swole.
Or the only of the major deities, the only one as far as the official ones within the world's most litigious role playing game, the only one who it really made sense to me to have something like turn undead is the Raven Queen.
Or if we go to other planes that don't have the Raven Queen, Weejas, goddess of death. How do I remember Weejas, goddess of death? She was the only god I would ever pick for clerics when I was playing 3. It's like, I just like being part of the god of death.
Yeah. Now maybe one could say Palo or something like that because of the whole light thing, but not really. If you look at a lot of light or sun gods, that's generally not what they lean into.
They lean into burning away the impure, which could be said that the undead are a part of.
But undead is too specific for that.
Yes.
And
because sun gods also burn away plenty of mythical beings that are associated with darkness.
I'm attacking the darkness.
I'd like to cast magic missile. Where? At the darkness. There you go. For those of you who don't get that, you are too young. Get off this fucking podcast.
You have to be this tall to ride this ride.
Monk, that's not fair to anyone. That means nobody can ride the ride but us. He said this tall and didn't specify anyone other than himself, so I was going to assume himself. It's self-referential humor.
Possibly. That's a good possibility of a definite maybe.
Coop says he came looking for a bullet ballet. When did we become Bayonetta?
Although, and even in, I do find, I think the reason why to get back on that whole Tolkien melting pot, because we noticed, we look at video games, we look at other forms of fiction and the like, and this whole we shouldn't use gunpowder thing isn't as present. I think it is because of this idea of a default that nobody questioned, as mentioned before. But I also think that I've said this before when it came to the whole people don't learn how to roleplay right. A lot of people aren't teaching them to question when they start getting into the hobby, whether of fantasy gaming, whatever the form may take. Not in the reason why I harp on the culture of conformity is that you are discouraging people to explore and experiment with their creativity.
Yeah. It is anathema to creativity.
That could be related to the ego thing, in that they are not creative enough. They are aware of it, so they don't want others to be creative.
That could be. Though I will say, having dealt with people who are in the ivory towers, I don't think that they're unimaginative. I just think
what I meant is not exactly in a specific sense. That is, they could be imaginative for other areas of the game or the fiction or whatever, but for that particular area, they don't like that weakness to be exposed.
Maybe.
Why do you suppose some people would be that insecure about it?
because they simply either they don't have a talent for that creativity in that specific direction. Simply they haven't explored it at all. They haven't explored it, so they feel exposed like, oh no, they are going to start talking about that or applying that to their games and whatnot. I won't be able to apply any of my knowledge or expertise or talent or whatnot.
Do you suppose that which is kind of ironic because this is a medium that is all about creativity.
Mm-hmm.
Creativity and discovering new ways to do things. Monk, I'm going to say it now because this is true of both of us. There is no fucking way that we think that we know every way to be creative in every game. Absolutely not. We're constantly learning new shit. Constantly.
Why do you think I keep interviewing people?
Exactly. Everybody. There's anybody who thinks that they know it all. You've just hit the Dunning-Kruger effect. Have fun with that.
Mm-hmm.
You've probably heard the expression to some extent of the only thing I know is that I know nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Buddha.
Mm-mm. It's also the reason why. Well, since you brought up Buddha, I'll bring up the Zen koan that I bring up a lot. The whole if you meet Buddha on the road, kill him.
Mm-hmm.
A koan that is usually interpreted, and mind you, koan interpretations, there's no one answer. That's kind of the point of a Buddhist koan, is to make you think.
Mm-hmm.
But
I will also say, kill God.
Yep. If you meet Buddha on the road, kill Buddha. If you meet God on the road, kill God. Yes. This koan is usually interpreted to mean that you should follow your own path and not blindly follow the Buddha.
Yeah,
usually.
There was someone who had commented on it who had approached a monk about wanting him to teach him, and that monk had told him, "You don't need a teacher. Sinkatsa is your teacher."
You're gonna have to explain that one to the people; they won't get it.
Sinkatsa, which I know I've butchered the pronunciation, is referring to the concept of emptiness in Buddhism. The idea is that in this case, relying on a teacher, in that sense, relying on someone else to putting it on someone else to teach you what is an internal path, would ultimately hamper your growth because you'd be too reliant on said teacher. That's always been how I've interpreted that concept.
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of people, they got in through someone else being the GM and learn and observing their GMing style and then trying to replicate that style. In the process of replicating that style, being slavish to that style. And because of that chain, there's not really an incentive to do what a lot of people claim you do with role playing games, but never practice, and that is use the toolkit to make your own fun. There's this weird setup where people are like, well, just play the game your way. No, not that way. I really saw that with that one video that was making the rounds about how doing character builds is anathema to role playing. Except you're gonna have when people want to play to win in some form, or just not be an anchor on the rest of the group. This kind of thing is going to happen. and it's also it's kind of contradictory to say play your way, but then all of a sudden say that you shouldn't play this way. I know some people have an issue with min-maxing. Um, but truth be told, min-maxing is an element of it will always be an element of gameplay.
Not to mention that the challenge is not to erase min-maxing, but to encourage min-maxers to not min-max because it's more fun that way.
Or that or the issue becomes when you feel you have to. Like nobody likes a boss fight that in order to win you have to cheese it.
Mm-hmm.
And no, and in the same vein, if I have to if I want to play a monk, but I have to go through all these extra steps to optimize so I'm not an anchor, that's a problem. Looking at you, 3rd edition monk. And Pathfinder 1E monk as well. Like the Pathfinder and the Pathfinder Unchained monks are slightly better, but that's the key word, slightly.
They lose the base will save though.
They still have the mad problem, which is my bigger focus. I.e., this is something we talked about yesterday, the whole multiple ability dependency.
Yeah.
But shifting back into firearms. If somebody asked me, in something like like 5e, how would you handle the introduction of firearms? And I'd say, well, it depends on what sort of firearms and what sort of tech level I'm working with. If I'm using the good old gunpowder approach, I could have it that it's specific to certain regions, which is more or less what Pathfinder does. The reason for the gunslingers in that setting is the region that practice comes from doesn't have access to magic.
And firearms feature quite prominently in the Dragon Heist module. Depending on the enemy that you're facing, there is a faction that employs quite a bit of firearms because the firearms are imported from Lantern, the realm of the gnomes.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I'd probably do is have them be able to ignore or penalize the AC of a target, but they're single shot. You know, there's ways to give advantages and disadvantages that make it an option to explore. Or you could always take the amethyst approach and have it that you can use them, but unless you have some degree of magic associated with you, in which case using them might cause problems. Arcanum also does that. Like the more magic that your character is inclined towards, the less of the tech that you can have access to, and the less of technology people will let you interact with. Because technology requires repeatable phenomena. That goes out the window when magic is concerned, and when it comes to the trains, there's a concern that messing around with magic could mess around with how the train works. So in Arcanum, which is a very good CRPG, I should note. It's got a bit of jank, but I still enjoy it. if you've got a little bit of magic on you, you may be encouraged to sit at the back of the train. If you've got too much, you may not be able to get on the train at all. But on the other hand, you might have access to magic-based fast travel. You know, these are things that can be explored. But the idea that you're just not supposed to do something is essentially doing a dead end of a concept, and you're leaving possibilities on the table when you do that. That's been my approach, and as I've stated in the past, you should be able to explore a variety of possibilities with tabletop, because the barrier to entry is not nearly as present. Like if someone wants to do some creative stuff with video games, there's a bunch of programming knowledge that they're going to need to know. You don't have that kind of barrier with tabletop games.
You just need your pencil and your paper, your eraser. That's it.
Yeah, if somebody wants to make a TTRPG now, they can do it. There might be barriers if you want to make something a bit fancier, but there's nothing stopping you from just writing a bunch of rules in a notebook and just improvising the rest. I'm pretty sure we all have at least one story of doing just that. Lord knows I do, and Lord knows you're never going to see any of those rule sets because they all sucked. But then again, more often than not, the first thing you do sucks. Because I'm pretty sure none of us remember are all that fond of every aspect of the first session that we GM'd.
I plead the fifth.
You don't count. But you know what I mean when it comes to this.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think there's also there's also the whole thing of you can have when it comes to firearms, if you want to go with the balance right, you can have firearms have an advantage, but also major disadvantages, like say misfiring or running the risk of the gun exploding.
Mm-hmm.
And there is one. And as far as the idea of introducing it into a fantasy setting, there is one anime that Zen and I have talked about quite a bit that at the tail end kind of explored this concept and probably would go further if we got a season 2.
Please no.
Drifters.
No. It hasn't gotten a season 2 since 2017 because Kota Hirano can't write fast enough.
Oh, write and draw, and that's the downside with that detailed seinen style. It takes a while, and a lot of ink.
Very, very, very expensive amounts of ink sometimes.
But with that, after being introduced to the concept of firearms to the dwarves, it doesn't take them long before they figure out, one, how to refine it, and two, how to make more of it. Because you recall that whole scene of, we can only make it was a bit of a rush job, so we're only able to make this many amount.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, that's fine. You can only make that amount of week. No, a day. Wait, what?
He's like, only 10? You can only make 10? Yes, we can only make 10 a day. Trying to push any further is bad. He's like, wait, 10 a day? Oh, that's more than enough.
Hmm. And the thing, the reason I bring that kind of thing up is a lot of maybe it's just me, but I feel like a lot of people say, "Oh, the campaign's in a generic fantasy setting," as a way to not think about the world that they're trying to set when they put people in it. And yeah, for your basic kind of beer and pretzels, you shouldn't really have to. But I've seen this argument be made even with stuff that isn't beer and pretzels. Of course, there's also the fact that what people count as fantasy, as we've made very clear, is very limiting when it doesn't have to be. But I think I'm trying to remember the first time that Final Fantasy, for instance, introduced firearms. I want to.
The latest would be 7. It might have shown up before.
I'm very certain it showed up beforehand.
I'm trying to think, but nothing really comes to mind.
Well, you had Magi Tech in Final Fantasy VI.
I can't think of any like actual firearm type thing. Like I think they skipped straight to lasers.
Mm-hmm.
Let me.
You had like airship weaponry in 4, if you want to count that.
I mean, while technically not actually Final Fantasy and only called Final Fantasy in in the US because
Legends.
Square, yes, Final Fantasy Legend 1 had guns. I mean, those are Saga games, so technically doesn't count.
I'm looking at the wiki to look at the jobs in 5. And
No, I'm not even looking for it as a weapon for characters to use. I'm looking at it depicted any time. I'm pretty sure there were cannon in fucking 4.
Yeah, the airship cannons.
There was the airship cannons.
And the dwarf tanks.
Mm-hmm.
The dwarves had tanks. Don't forget that.
And as far as 3, let's see. Let me check something. You know what? I've been doing this backwards. So you had firearms being used in the Legend of the Crystals movie.
Mm-hmm.
You definitely, and you've gradually had some manner of steam tech in some form. Of course, you had guns and tactics. Which and tactics technically was the same year as 7.
Yeah, but there were guns and cannon, story-wise, well before then.
Yeah.
It's just thinking of like characters that actually like would hold and fire a gun is what I'm trying to think of.
Mhm.
I don't think we should limit ourselves to that.
Yeah.
We're falling into
I
the
know.
same
That's what I'm saying.
trap.
Like 4 would probably be the first one then, because if you're counting like the tanks and cannons and all that.
Mhm.
Of course, I'm going to count the goddamn
Yeah.
tanks. Dwarf tanks.
But
And,
no dwarf guns, just tanks.
yeah, and there's been in something like say Tails, they've been it's been present for quite a while. Uh, like Tales of Destiny 2 had it in some form. Um, but it's gonna trying to figure out when they first showed up in the Tales series is going to be a bit trickier since there's a lot more to work with. But let me do one.
I think it's safe to say that fantasy games, when we come to video games, have had some sort of gunpowder weaponry in them for quite a long time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And of course,
Not even bringing up the nonsense that was Ultima.
No
Swords, spaceships.
No, let us let us not only bring in the nonsense of Ultima, let's also bring in the nonsense of Might and Magic.
Hmm.
To be fair, I'm not too familiar with Might and Magic outside of a couple games, but
Oh,
yeah.
aliens, laser weapons, those were all present, and it got completely nuts. Same thing applies with wizardry, which is why the idea of high fantasy roots is just as laughable there. And there's been I distinctly remember that the alchemist class in I think Wizardry 8 had a fucking gun. I think it was either alchemist or engineer. It's been a long time since I played Wizardry 8. Mostly because that game hurts me.
It hurts you, Mildra?
You've no doubt played Wizardry. You know how it is.
I'm going to memory hole that memory again now.
See? And obviously, Wizardry has had a lengthy bit of games, but a lot of the classic entries when it comes to fantasy play fast and loose about how medieval their medieval fantasy is. We already mentioned Final Fantasy having airships. Their Tales goes all over the place. Wild Arms never even tried to have that approach because it was trying to emulate the Old West in its own way.
Still waiting on more news for that spiritual successor. Forget what it was called off the top of my head.
Armed Fantasia.
Yeah.
I'd imagine it's going to be quite a while for any news on that.
Yeah. There is a distinctly Wild Arm shaped hole in gaming these days.
Give me a few minutes and I can find something that can come close. Unless it has to be with that particular name, in which case I will remind you, games, not names.
That's why I'm waiting on Fantasia.
You know, it's when some folk were like, why don't we have any game that had the same that was like, why don't we have any successor to Chrono Trigger?
We do.
Mm-hmm.
We have a few.
Yeah, and then when I say that, they're like, but those aren't Chrono Trigger. Like, it if you're asking for Chrono Break, that never existed.
I would like to point out that both I Am Setsuna and Lost Sphere have elements of Chrono Trigger in them.
Mm-hmm.
It's not one for one, and nor should it be, but they're both fantastic games.
If you wanted one for one, well, even the guys behind the original didn't think doing one for one would be a good idea.
Or, if I'm going to be more of an asshole about it, if you want one for one, just go back and play Chrono Trigger! You want more Chrono Trigger? There you go. Pick up the console, pick up the cartridge, go play it again. Or if you're playing the DS version, pick up your DS, put in your DS card, play it again. If you're so in love with Chrono Trigger specifically, play it again.
It's actually been a while since I've replayed Chrono Trigger. I should do that at some point this year.
Just there can be a whole rant about that whole using nostalgia as a crutch, because it very much is. Because you notice the same people who have that attitude also have the attitude of nobody's making good games anymore. Which
we have an entire set of shitshow streams to show you how fucking wrong you are.
Mm-hmm.
Not just how wrong you are, how fucking wrong you are.
In fact, I actually think that there are too many good games out there. Sometimes I get just so dizzy thinking about all the things that I have yet to play.
I don't. I find it exciting that there's that much of a variety. It means there's something for everybody.
Abraham, I have a list 170 titles long of games I want to get at some point. Although I am about to make that 169 giggity lines long because I'm erasing Skull and Bones because, well, I think everybody knows why.
Mm-hmm. But of course, well, the other thing that I can't help but notice is that this mindset of no gunpowder, no firearms, it more or less comes from the grogs, and this is why I didn't dismiss that whole ego thing you mentioned earlier, because I do think you're onto something there. Because now, I'm not saying all of them, hashtag not all, but there are a lot of people within the quote-unquote old school community that because of the fact that they treat the way that they play games as some sort of identity, or worse, a sexual preference. Okay, maybe not that bad, but still. They are so personally invested in that idea that they end up creating their own problem.
They could see it a bit like a threat against their dogma and doctrine.
Or like when somebody has their manhood questioned. Or and I can hear Zen laughing in advance when a black man has his blackness questioned.
He's only saying that because he's black.
Fuck off.
You knew I was gonna make the joke. You even lampshaded it.
Because you're gonna do it anyways, so I may as well rip the Band-Aid off.
No, I could have made the other joke I had in mind. But then you set me up, so I had to make the joke.
Mm-mm. Or did I set you up on purpose because you couldn't ignore the bait?
Or did I not ignore the bait because I knew that you would respond the way I want you to?
See, now it sounds like the Sicilian thing into The Princess Bride.
The only slightly less known proverb is, never mess with a Sicilian when death is on the line.
Spoilers, they were both poisoned.
I spent years building up an immunity to iocane powder. Not how building up an immunity to poison works, but okay.
I think in that case I was willing to go with it because, well,
It's funny.
It's funny, and two, that level of confidence in the whole game. But when it I think that ego is the reason why when I look at some of the settings and some of the worlds that a lot of people in that crowd end up making, if I'm gonna be honest, I get put to sleep. Because okay, you're doing a dark fantasy inspired by the fantasy scene of the 1970s. Yawn. Now, if you said I'm doing a 70s style fantasy inspired by my love of He-Man, that's enough to keep me awake. Because now you at least have an identity. And I know some might say, well, what about Mork Borg? Mork Borg's identity is centered around its leaning into doom metal. That's not the core be all end all of it, but it is a major factor. Which is why I don't have the same issue. Plus, as far as the gunpowder question, people have already answered that. But if there's I see Dragon going generic fantasy by whose definition? By the definition of that grog mindset, of that Tolkien melting pot. It's a definition of a collective. A collective that all pretends that they're individuals, but a collective nonetheless. But I think a good way to go into the final stage of this particular adventure is going over games that do answer going over games and media that does answer the why not gunpowder question and what makes it work. And I'd like to do a bit of a hard mode with this. No steampunk. Too easy.
So you want an answer on why they do have guns?
Just examples of ones that do and that don't go with that actually do integrate guns in their fantasy setting. That each of us happen to like, that I may not have covered. And keep in mind, it doesn't have to be tabletop. And for me personally, if I was to use one example, even though I said no steampunk, the steampunkness of this is a bit all over the place. War Machine.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because you have the robots. Even though they're referred to as mechs, there's no piloting of them. And you have integrations of that technology into firearms. The reason why I say I can't say it's full steampunk is that it's steampunk leaning, but it's a lot of magipunk as well. Once again, playing fast and loose with genre definition. I'm pretty sure you guys have a few other examples that you can think of fantasy that's using firearms without a problem.
Record of the Agrist War, or Agrist Generations of War, depending on which release you're looking at.
Record of Agrest War is better because the Agrest Generations of War remake is a really shitty remake, actually. They didn't do a very good job of remaking it.
Yeah.
I never played the remake. I only have the original.
I still have my 360 disc of Agrest War.
Like, if you've never played it, it's fine to pick up the Steam version, but yeah, get the original better.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, technically, the Agrest ones on Steam are old enough to not be part of the remake.
Did they completely remake the game after that?
Agrest Marriage, I believe it was called.
I completely missed that one.
It's shit. Be glad you missed it.
But
Is nobody going to mention Berserk?
Yeah, we may as well go into Berserk because obviously there's the whole thing with Guts having the cannon arm.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe artillery use did happen in the Golden Age. I'd have to go back and double check, but I keep recalling that did happen. Because, well, during the Golden Age, you did have a fair amount of combat that was doing castle sieges. In fact, one of those sieges is how Guts first shows up. In the Golden Age, I should say. Obviously, there's the whole thing with the Black Swordsman arc.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd also there's quite a few manga in the fantasy end of things that could be brought up. Mostly because as I've talked about in the past, over in Asia, those huge walls when it comes to different genres aren't really as present. You know, you can have a wuxia story that just happens to have cyberpunk stuff, and it's not nobody's arguing that it isn't a wuxia story.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that there's a few that missing. But what about the rest? Zan, I know Monarch brought up Argrist, but what about you, Zan? What's one that comes to mind for you?
I'm going to bring up something that we've been talking about this entire time that people seem to forget. Middle Earth has firearms and gunpowder, technically.
Which is ironic, which brings the whole realism argument to a bit of irony.
And in fact, I will read a version of the story of Numenor, or at least an excerpt from it, published in The Lost Road. This is a Numenorian talking about the technology they have. Our ships go now without the wind, and many are made of metal that sheareth hidden rocks, and they sink not in calm or storm, but they are no longer fair to look upon. Our towers grow ever stronger and climb ever higher, but beauty they leave behind upon the earth. We who have no foes are embattled with impregnable fortresses, and mostly on the west. Our arms are multiplied as if for an age-long war, and men are ceasing to give love or care to the making of other things for use or delight. But our shields are impenetrable, our swords cannot be withstood. Our darts are like thunder and pass over leagues unerring. Like thunder and passes through leagues? That's a sniper rifle. That's a fucking firearm.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there's the breaching of Helm's Deep using gunpowder. There's the fight at Minas Tirith, where Sauron's forces are using literally blasting breaches. There's this line from Lord of the Rings. Now ever and anon there was a red flash, and slowly through the heavy air dull rumbles could be heard. They have taken the wall, men cried. They are blasting breaches in it. They are coming. There was gunpowder in Middle-earth.
Mm-hmm. And
also, I won't count Chrono Trigger because that's time travel. I will count Chrono Cross.
Which is dimensional travel.
It's different.
That's goalpost shifting, you dick.
Look, time travel and dimensional travel are two different things.
You are technically correct, but it's still goalpost shifting.
you're both right. But I've already mentioned a handful of entries, but I will for this bring up Exalted, because it had the flame pieces, which it describes as shooting fireballs, but let's be honest, we know what's going on with that.
Also throw in later entries of the Shannara books.
Mm-hmm.
No, Shannara is a special exception. Remember that Shannara happens after a post-apocalypse of modern Earth, specifically in the Oregon and Seattle region.
Shannara got a little weird. I'm not gonna lie, but I'll count it.
Mm-hmm. The point is that there's a variety of options, and
I've got one last example, and it's a recent example, and everybody may be surprised to hear this example, since this example hasn't had guns up until its newest game, or I should say gunpowder. Fire Emblem Engage has cannons as a weapon type. Specifically, it's called Cannonball, but Fire Emblem finally got some gunpowder in there, Monk.
Mm-hmm. I know some people really don't like Engage, but I will render judgment when the time comes. But I have a feeling I'm going to be looking at things a little bit differently, because I usually end up looking at things a little bit differently. That's been the crux of this channel for almost 10 years now.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is that don't tell me that you can't have firearms in a fantasy setting. Now, if you don't want them in a fantasy setting because that's your preference, that's one thing. But the idea that the entire genre has to have things done a certain way, that I will always call into question. And I think that's as strong of a point to end on this. But this isn't quite the end of the live streams for this week, because tomorrow we'll be doing monastic therapy, covering all the shit that's gone down with Niji Sanji, or Kuro Sanji as they've been called now. I
like to call them Niji Salty.
Mm-hmm.
I just like.
I think you can save that for the fans who keep trying to downplay everything. I will be doing 2 interviews on Tuesday. One of them with Fern the Hex on his Midnight Glamours project. The other with Chronoforge. I'm going to be doing the doubleheader on Wednesday as well. one covering Soul Twinkle's publishing, and the other with Double Summon Games, who have been developing the Perfect Draw TTRPG, which has been doing very well in its crowdfund in the last few days. Thursday in the morning, I will be doing an interview with Legitanime Games, who apparently was already subscribed to this channel, and I didn't even know. Thursday night, Monarch and I will be returning to look at the talent system in Shattered. And Friday, Zan and I will be I believe we're continuing our look. Yeah, we are. We're going to be looking at the professions in Dames of Astoria.
Don't you mean the disciplines?
Yeah, disciplines. These things crosswire.
Yeah, they're essentially your class packages.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll get there.
And Friday there will be the return of the Adventures of the Monk and the Monarch, but also the triumphant return of Cloister the Dice as we dive into the campaign. Sorry,
I believe he meant to say Saturday.
Yeah, Saturday. The campaign of Aboard the Magic Railroad, our Sword World actual play. And of course, we will be back here next week for a new edition of GeekWatch, so please look forward to that. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra, I am your gaming monk, and join the watch.